So in the last lecture, we had gotten to the point where we had seen the radiation of archosaurs, of ruling reptiles, during the Triassic period. And that the Pseudosuchia, the clade that would eventually include crocodilians, was the dominant group. They were the group that took off first, they diversified first, and in their shadow was another group, the Ornithidyrans, that started off as relatively small, that were relatively fleet-footed, and I was showing some of their adaptations, and the adaptation that they get their name from, the bird neck, the ability to rotate or pull their neck backwards into an S shape, because their cervicals were quite differently shaped than their dorsals. Another attribute that we see in Ornithidyrans is what we call digitigrade posture, at least in the early ones. That, as we'll see later on when we talk about pterosaurs in detail, they go back to being flat-footed. So what do I mean by that? Well, a foot, the way our feet interact with the substrate, with the ground, is different in different types of vertebrates, of tetrapods. The ancestral condition is what we call plantigrade, flat-footed. And that is the ancestral condition. My lizards, they put all their metatarsus, and for that matter, their metacarpus, down against the ground. So the palms of their hands, the soles of their feet are touching the ground. Look at a raccoon, they do that. A bear, they do that. A salamander does that. We do that. We're plantigrade. Most pseudoseuchians, a crocodile does this. Pterosaurs do this. But dinosauromorphs, and at least some specialized pseudoseuchians, and eventually specialized mammals, walk in what we call digitigrade posture. That's walking on the balls of their feet. So the balls of the feet and their toe and their ankle is up above the ground. This actually gives them sort of a greater coverage as they're swinging their feet back and forth. Now, no dinosaur or pseudoseuchian ever achieved this other posture, unguligrade. That's standing on tiptoes. That's limited to specialized hoofed mammals in the history of life. So, and not only do they have a digitigrade stance, so they're walking on the balls of their feet, they're also dinosauromorphs, and it looks like Ornithidyrans ancestrally have what we call a parasagittal stance. So if you remember, the sagittal plane is this plane down the middle of the body. Parasagittal means parallel to the sagittal plane. So dinosaurs were striders. So this advantage of having the legs directly underneath the body gets rid of this aspect of physiology called carrier's constraint. I don't think I gave you the name of that before, but that's the observation that ancestrally the muscles that you use to breathe, to move your ribs, are also the muscles you use in locomotion as you're moving back and forth. And so it's hard to breathe and to walk at the same time. But if your legs are directly underneath the body, those are an entirely different set of muscles. You're not using those side muscles at all to move. And so you can be well oxygenated and moving at the same time. You can be a lot more active. And so dinosaurs in ancestry have this. Some pseudoseuchians have this ancestrally. Pseudoseuchians normally are something in between. So here's two living examples of a pseudoseuchian and an ornithidyran. And advanced mammals have this as well. We have legs that are directly underneath our body. So here we have a living ornithidyran and a living therian mammal walking in a parasagittal stance. Look like they're up to no good. And if you think back, this was one of the attributes that Owen first recognized when he named Dinosauria as a clade, well, as a group. That these were reptiles of the ancient world whose limbs were directly underneath the body, or now they have a parasagittal stance. And as I said, it evolves independently among archosaurs. There's actually some differences between the way pseudoseuchians achieve it and dinosaurs and their kin achieve it. Now, in Ornithidyra, I mentioned there's one branch that's called Pterosauromorpha that includes the pterosaurs and recently recognized some of the early small-bodied forms that are closer to them. And another branch, which are the Dinosauromorpha, dinosaurs and everything closer to them than the pterosaurs. And here are some early representatives. A tiny little one, that's actually I should call it Logasuchus. It's gone back to being called Logasuchus again. You see, it's an animal that you could eat comfortably, hold in your hands. I'm probably struggling. And a slightly larger one, I don't know, the size of a medium-sized dog, representative of an important group of early dinosauromorphs. Now, given that that all the dinosauromorphs are walking in a digitigrade stance, and most pseudoseuchians walk in a plantigrade stance, you can actually track their record literally, because they have different types of footprints. Pseudoseuchian tracks will have a heel mark, because they're walking flat-footed. Dinosaurs and their kin are walking on the tips of their toes. And indeed, our oldest evidence of dinosauromorphs aren't from body fossils, they're from trace fossils. Trace fossils that go back to the early Triassic. And remember, that early Triassic phase is super short. It's just a few million years. So dinosauromorphs arose in the earliest days of the Mesozoic era. Now, among the dinosauromorphs, there are two major groups that are closer to each other than the early tiny ones. These include a group I'm going to talk about momentarily called the Silesaurids, and another group called, well, the dinosaurs. And those two groups are united. We recognize their shared ancestry by, among other things, the presence of an elongation of the pubis and the ischium relative to the ancestral condition. When we talk about physiology later on, we'll talk about how this might help by pumping more air through the body. It actually gives a bigger motion when those gastralia are compressing, and so you're flooding out more air and flooding in more air, so you're getting more oxygen back and forth. But notice that Silesaurids, so here we see, and it's the Silesaurus itself, this is the pelvis in lateral view, and this is the sort of the pelvis on the opposite side in medial view. We don't normally see it from the inside looking out. And notice that the acetabulum, that is the hip socket, is solid. That's the ancestral condition, is that all three bones meet in the middle and there's a cup of bone there. Dinosaurs are different. Dinosaurs have an open or perforate acetabulum. That bony wall in the back has been lost. We'll talk a little more about that in a moment. So Silesaurids, the next best thing to dinosaurs. They were first recognized as a group in the beginning of the century, or maybe at the tail end of the last century. But it turns out we've been finding them all along. We thought they were like bits and pieces of dinosaurs of various stripes, but it turns out they're not, or they're probably not, as we'll see. So here's Silesaurus, the best known one. It's a typical one. In life, this is about the size of a Labrador, maybe. That's a good model for that. Upright stance, digitigrade, parasagittal stance, digitigrade posture, but still quadrupedal, four-legged. Early Silesaurids, the most primitive one, Luisuchus here, is carnivorous. Now that's not a surprise. Carnivorous diet is the ancestral diet for amniotes in general, and certainly for archosaurs. And so here in its skull, we see these blade-like serrated teeth, good for shredding meat. We'll see those teeth in plenty of carnivorous dinosaurs. But specialized Silesaurids, indeed most Silesaurids, have different shaped teeth. They're no longer for shredding meat. They're for chopping up plants. Because most of the Silesaurids were herbivores, or plant eaters. And so here's a reconstructed skull of Silesaurus itself. And it's got this little bitty beak in front. I'll come back to that later. They have often 3, sometimes more, sacral vertebrae. We'll see that's a trait that is similar to what many dinosaurs have. But as I mentioned before, they don't have an open acetabulum. They have a closed acetabulum, which is the ancestral condition. I've already shown that picture. I'll go on ahead. I'll just say, most of them are relatively small. We have bits and pieces, literally bits and pieces. It's those 2 little white bits there. So it's the ends of the femur. That suggests some of them were actually bigger. Some of them were bigger than a human being. And they were a relatively important part of the Triassic medium-sized herbivores in the middle and late part of the Triassic. So now we've reached the late Triassic epoch of the Triassic period. And we still have a world that's Pangea. And in this world, even though dinosaurs have arisen, we'll talk about them momentarily, The dinosaurs are not the dominant group. It's still a Pseudotsuchian-dominated world. There's many other types of creatures. So we've got some Pseudotsuchians around here, but we still have big Dicynodont therapsids. We have dinosaurs. We have pterosaurs. We even have the earliest phases of mammal evolution, but it's the Pseudotsuchians that are the top dogs, or maybe the top crocs. Here's a Pseudotsuchian called Postasuchus munching on a Silesaur. In fact, at this time, we have the largest of the therapsids, at least until the Cenozoic era. So this is a rhino-sized Dicynodont that appears at the very end of the Triassic, one of the largest herbivores of its time, but not the largest. We'll get to those later. Also, during the late Triassic, we have some groups that we might think of as a lot more mundane today, although their early appearances don't look like their final form, or their current form, I should say. We have frogs, Triadobatrachus, a frog. But notice it's a frog without jumping legs, so it hasn't quite evolved the habit that we think of with frogs, but it's closer to frogs than salamanders. We have turtles with shells, or at least half shells. They actually don't have the armored back, but they've got the armored belly. And we have crocodiles. Okay, not actually crocodilia itself, not the modern freshwater semi-aquatic predators, but that creature there, Pseudohesperasuchus, is part of a lineage that we call Crocodilomorpha, that survives today as crocodiles. They're specialized sorts of Pseudotsuchians. And notice the early ones, by the way, that's shown bigger than life size. It's like a fox-sized animal. The earliest members of this group, closer to crocs than to these big things like Postasuchus and so forth, were actually fast-running, small-bodied terrestrial carnivores. So this idea that crocodiles are unchanged since the beginning of the age of dinosaurs is crap. That doesn't look like a crocodile, and yet that's closer to a crocodile than any creature I've shown you so far. Modern-type crocodiles evolved much later, during the Mesozoic era. And we appear. Not humans, of course, not even placental mammals, but mammals in the broad sense, a specialized group within the therapsid synapsids. In fact, within the cynodont therapsid synapsids, evolved during the late Triassic. We'll talk about the mammal story towards the end of the course. But just to let you know, mammals are appearing about the same time that dinosaurs did. The pterosaurs appear during the Triassic. We will also talk about them in far more detail in a later lecture in the third section of the course. But they appear shortly after like the earliest dinosaurs. And when they appear, they are full-fledged pterosaurs. So they had an earlier history when they didn't quite look as advanced as they did later on. I think of them as dinosaur, that should be an apostrophe in there, dinosaurs' funny-looking flying cousins. But of course, in the Triassic, in the late Triassic, we have the Dinosauria, which of course is the focus of this course. If this was called Crocodilomorpha, a natural history, you wouldn't have come to this. So we'll pick up now in the new slide set and look at the rise of dinosaurs proper. So what is a dinosaur? We saw at the end of the second section of the course, I gave you the definition. I also gave it on the first lecture, so let's go through it again. Dinosaurs are the concestor of Iguanodon, Diplodocus, and Megalosaurus, and all of its descendants. So we find the most recent common ancestor of these three genera, and anything that descended from that ancestor is a dinosaur. But how do we recognize dinosaurs? How are they different from their cousins? Well, at first glance, one of the important differences is that they're bipedal. They're walking on their hind legs. In fact, it's more than that. They are obligate bipeds. That means they couldn't walk on all fours. They've evolved to be two-legged animals. A consequence of that is it freed up the manus. The manus is now a hand. It's not just a front paw. It's a hand for grasping. Now, some of you might be thinking, but wait, what about Triceratops and Stegosaurus and Brontosaurus? They're quadrupeds. We will see, as we march through the family tree of dinosaurs, how various groups independently go back to being quadrupedal. But they started off as bipeds. These actually represent the three major branches, or three of the major branches of dinosaurs. Tawa, actually I could have chosen someone else. Tawa is probably a Herrerasaur now, so whatever. Don't worry. Another thing that actually you could see with this diagram is, as projected, that's life size. Dinosaurs were small when they first appeared. They were small-bodied animals. They were not the giants. These sorts of creatures were walking around and running around in an environment with big Pseudotsuchian protocrocs as the apex predators, and with the big galumphing herbivorous armored aedosaurs, those herbivorous armored Pseudotsuchians as large herbivores and so forth. So what are some of the more specific ways we recognize dinosaurs? Well, a trivial point, but I'm just going to show it because it's on the figure, is the back end of the jugal. From the side view shows this little prong, this little forked prong. Not an important thing. I'm never going to quiz you on that, but just showing it's there. Sometimes the things we use in terms of recognizing one group from another is small. And a more important one is this. We've long recognized this as a trait, but the function we've only begun to really appreciate. It's called the frontoparietal fossa. So a fossa is a depression. Frontoparietal, so it's on the frontals and the parietals. Not a big surprise there. What is it? Well, all diapsids have the supratemporal fenestra, but in many of them, the supratemporal fenestra is more constrained. In dinosaurs, and independently, in the crocodile lineage, the depression for this expands forward onto the frontals, onto the parietals to some degree. Traditionally, the classic interpretation was that this was to increase the surface area attachment for jaw muscles, to give stronger jaw muscles. But recent work by some of my colleagues who are excellent anatomists show that that's unlikely. It's rare, it's not impossible, it's rare to have muscles that are going along and then go at a right angle and still act well. And instead, they show that in crocodilians, and based on the texture of this area, this was actually probably covered by vascular tissue rather than muscle. The muscles would have been below. Why have a lot of vascular tissue on top? In modern crocodilians, it's used as kind of a radiator to dump heat out of the head. And that dinosaurs may have used that as well. Why do you need to dump heat out of your head? Well, as we'll talk, I keep saying in the third section of the course, but the third section of the course is important too. In the third section of the course, when we talk about physiology, we'll talk about there's a lot of adaptations in dinosaurs and in other animals to make sure the blood that reaches the brain is cool. That it's not too hot, because you can't uncook a brain. And in active animals, you run that risk. Another dinosaurian trait, related to the fact that they've got these big grasping hands, is that a feature called the delta pectoral crest, which is a projection on the humerus, is very big. So, hang on. Large delta pectoral crest. So here we go, that's the delta pectoral crest. It's a projection coming off the humerus for big muscles. And so here it is in a dinosaur, and we can compare it to show dinosaurs and a possible dinosaur up here. Not very much is known of it, but it's got a big delta pectoral crest, so we think it's either a dinosaur or the sister group to dinosaurs. And here are other archosaurs, including Silesaurids. So another type, and Silesaurs, these are Silesaurids. These are dinosauromorphs, but they're not dinosaurs, and their DP crest is not as big. So that one form, Nyasasaurus, is from the middle Triassic of the nation of Tanzania. If it's a dinosaur, it's our oldest definite dinosaur, but it's not a definite dinosaur because there's just such little known of it. This is a very hopeful reconstruction, but we know only a couple bones from it. So it could potentially be the sister group to Dinosauria proper. We don't know that it's a descendant of the ancestor of the Iguanodon megalosaurus and Diplodocus. Now another dinosaurian trait is the specialized dinosaur hand. So in dinosaur hands, just to highlight a couple traits, the thumb is a thumb. Manual digit 1 is at an angle compared to the other two. And metacarpals 4 and 5 and their respective digits are reduced. So I've shown this picture. Now I'm going to show it here on a more comprehensive view. So a dinosaurian, well, this is not a dinosaur, this is a human hand. And this is a typical primitive dinosaur hand. We have an opposable thumb, a fully opposable thumb. Our opposability is achieved because we have a really flexible joint at the base of metacarpal 1. That's really rare. That's one of the things that makes a human hand really special. Dinosaurs didn't have that. Like most animals, metacarpal 1 is in sort of a firm lock with the other metacarpals. But the angle that digit 1 is at a different angle than the other digits. So they had a semi-opposable hand. They could grip. And that's part of the thing. They have hands. They didn't have front paws. They had hands. Also, whereas we retain the primitive trait in having big digits 4 and 5, in the dinosaur hand, the ring finger and the pinky, that's 4 and 5, are reduced. And so here we see in various types of early dinosaur branches manifestations of this hand in different ways. So dinosaurs have very specialized hands. Now, you might think, well, the hand of a Triceratops or a Stegosaurus or a Brachiosaurus doesn't look like that. Yeah, because in various groups, they're going to be specialized in different ways. Iguanodon hand doesn't look like this. Tyrannosaurus' hand doesn't look like this. But early dinosaurs had hand like this. That then got modified. Owen recognized that all the dinosaurs he knew of had 5 or more sacral vertebrae, but he only knew about 3 dinosaurs. And so we have since found that many of the early dinosaurs had 3 sacral vertebrae, 3 bones in the pelvis that connect with the ilium. That's more than most amniotes have. Most amniotes have 2. And if it weren't for some really annoying primitive Triassic dinosaurs, we could comfortably say that 3 or more is a dinosaurian trait. But there are some primitive Triassic carnivorous dinosaurs who only have 2. Maybe it's a reversal, or maybe it's convergence among these various groups to have 3 or more. So just to point out, when Owen was naming Dinosauria, remember that was Iguanodon, Hylaeosaurus, and Megalosaurus. Megalosaurus is over here, and Iguanodon and Hylaeosaurus are here, and that's why he thought 5 was what united them all. It turns out that that was convergence. I've already shown this one, but yes, the perforate acetabulum, an open acetabulum. Well, we say open, but that only refers to the bone. In life, so this is a section through it. We're looking at it from anterior view. There would have been a sheet of tissue back here. So it's not like the femur is sticking into the guts. There would have been soft tissue, but it doesn't preserve. And in fact, all those colored features, other than the sort of tail tan, which is bone, all the other colored tissues are soft tissues that don't typically preserve. But why exactly did they lose that? We don't know. But they did. It probably helped with the motion of the leg back and forth more efficiently. Because dinosaurs with this parasagittal stance and that hinge-like ankle joint, they didn't have a lot of action going on with the legs side to side and so forth. It was mostly constrained to this forward-backward striding motion. But they did that pretty well. Now, one of the most contentious issues right now in understanding dinosaurs is whether or not having a fuzzy body covering is an ancestral dinosaurian trait. In the lineage that contains horned dinosaurs and armored dinosaurs and duckbills and so forth, there are definite specimens that either have fuzz or quills. In the carnivorous dinosaur lineage, we definitely have the presence of fuzz in some, as well as actual feathers. Since those represent 2 very different branches of Dinosauria, it's possible that those evolved convergently. But it's also possible that having a fuzzy body covering is ancestral to Dinosauria. And possibly even deeper than that. But again, I'm going to repeat myself, that's a story for the third section of the course. I'm just going to throw this out here. Pterosaurs, their funny-looking cousins, also have a fuzzy body covering. So you can see some of this fuzz preserved up here. It's not a great picture, but there it is on a small bird-hipped dinosaur. There it is closer up, preserved in carbonized form. So we got fuzz in at least some early branches of Ornithischia. We have very many over here in the theropods. Did fuzz or quills evolve over here? Well, at present, we don't have any evidence of fuzz in the branch of everything closer to Diplodocus than the other two. But to be fair, we don't have good, we've never found those guys in the right sort of deposits to preserve that. However, as I'll talk about in a moment, there are alternative arrangements of the phylogeny of dinosaurs. And it might be that fuzz or quills isn't a dinosaurian trait, but further up, it's an ornithoscelidan trait. We're still working on this. It could still be convergent. I hypothesize that what we can say is that the capacity to generate fuzz, we call plumulose structures, or derivatives of plumulose structures, is ancestral for dinosaurs. But just because you have the capacity for it doesn't mean you express it in the same way. And depending on aspects of the environments in which they live and their size and so forth, it gets expressed in different ways in different groups. Because we absolutely know that many dinosaurs had a scaly body covering. So down at the bottom here, this is the skin impression of Triceratops, which actually has great big scales. I mean, you would see them as scaly from a distance. And we have scales on duckbills, and there's scales on this little horned dinosaur, even though it also has quills. And we got fuzz on Sauromimus, and we got feathers on a Dromaeosaur raptor. Okay. Dinosauria, as I talked about before, has three major branches. There's Theropoda. That's Megalosaurus and everything closer to Meg than to Ig or Dippy. I'm using this as shorthand. You should too. There's Ornithischia. Ornithischia is Iguanodon and everything closer to Ig than to Meg or Dippy. And there's Sauropodomorpha. That's Diplodocus and everything closer to Diplodocus than to Meg or Ig. Earlier versions of this course, prior to March 2017, I would start this by having everything closer to Ig than Meg, and everything closer to Meg than Ig. But now I have to do three versions for reasons I'll talk about momentarily. So three major branches. You've seen a slide like this before, so this is not brand new. And then Dinosauria is the whole shebang. All descendants of the concestor of Megalosaurus, Diplodocus, and Iguanodon. And dinosaurs, all three branches have those traits that I've just talked about. And just to give you a very brief overview, we will be marching through these groups one by one over the course of the next couple weeks. There are the so-called bird-hipped dinosaurs, the Ornithischians. We'll cover them first, starting on Friday in detail, and continuing on in the early part of next week. Then the Sauropodomorphs, the long-necked plant eaters. We'll start them at the Friday of next week and continue on into the Monday following that. And then the great dinosaurs, and then the theropods, the carnivorous dinosaurs, who we'll spend many lectures on. A, because they're awesome, but B, because it's within this lineage that we get the origin of birds. So those are the three major branches. And then there are various assorted Triassic dinosaurs for whom their exact phylogenetic position is uncertain. And I'll give you a version of them in the weeks, today and weeks to follow. but with the note, and it's discussed in the lecture notes online, that these are not firm positions, that these are primitive enough, it's hard to as definitely assign them to one group or the other as it is for more derived forms. So, let's start with the traditional phylogeny for dinosaurs. We're going to say in this course, this is the most likely one. We're not going to say it's the true one. We don't know what the true one is, but we can infer it. And I will say that the current weight of evidence best supports this one, but not overwhelmingly so. This hypothesis is called the Saurischian hypothesis. Saurischia is the clade comprised of Megalosaurus, Diplodocus, and everything more closely related to those two than to Iguanodon. So it's another way of thinking about it. It's the hypothesis that Sauropodomorphs and Theropods are closer to each other than the Ornithischians. From the 19th century, the later part of the 19th century, up until 2017, very few people challenged this idea. Or at least when they recognized dinosaurs as a single group. The Saurischian hypothesis was basically the default. There was good phylogenetic evidence for it. In fact, one of the first phylogenetic studies in dinosaurs was to help confirm the monophyly of Saurischia. But in 2017, that got challenged. We'll get to that challenge in a moment. So what makes a Saurischian a Saurischian? Don't worry about all these details. These figures are provided to you on the lecture notes. And if you want to explore some of these traits in more detail, you can. It's just to show you that there are traits that have been proposed to unite them. We will explore important traits. I'll typically have a slide if there's an important trait that I want you to recognize. So let's start with the name Saurischia. It means literally lizard pelvis, or actually more lizard hipped. And it means the word ischium is in there, but it's used in the sense of pelvis, not ischium proper. Because it's not the ischium, which is lizard-like. The ischium in everything points backwards. What goes on here in Saurischians, and some will say Saurischians, either one's fine, is that the pubis points forward. But that's a primitive trait. We are Saurischian in that context. We have a pubis that points forward. Most animals have a pubis point forward. And indeed, when Saurischia was named in the 1800s, it actually, although the phrasing of the name was lizard-hipped, the scientist, Seeley, who gave him a name, didn't use a forward-pointing pubis as the reason to unite the group. It's kind of a shame he didn't use this trait in the name. Because if he had, then generations upon generations of people wouldn't have been taught the wrong thing, which is that you recognize the Saurischian by a forward-pointing pelvis. It's a shame he didn't call them, pneumatospondyli or something. Because what Seeley recognized is that sauropodomorphs and theropods had these pneumatic, that is, air chambers in their vertebrae, whereas Ornithischians don't. So, there are holes from the outside that penetrate the vertebrae, both the centrum and in some cases the neural arch, that were for an air sac that filled part of the vertebra. We don't see that in Ornithischians. We do see it in sauropodomorphs. We see it in theropods. We actually see it in pterosaurs, but that's almost absolutely convergence. And we see it in a living group. That turns out it's a type of Saurischian. That living group is birds. Now, when Seeley named this, he didn't think that birds and Saurischians had a close relation. But now we know that birds are the living part of this clade. And the air sacs that penetrate the vertebrae are associated with a specialized form of respiration, which, fill in the thing I keep on saying. We'll talk about more in the third section of the course. And in fact, in ontogeny, in growth, we see that the pneumatic vertebrae of birds start in the posterior part of the cervicals And then as they get older, it advances anteriorly into the other cervicals and posteriorly into the rest of the skeleton. And intriguingly, in the oldest Saurischians, we see the pneumatic vertebrae starting in the posterior cervicals, and then as we march up the family tree of both groups, it extends anteriorly into the anterior cervicals and posteriorly into the posterior cervicals, and eventually, in some cases, into the postcranial skeleton. Sorry, into the appendicular skeleton. Also, it's worth noting that most early Saurischians have elongate, stretched out necks. So there's a theropod, Coelophysis, and a sauropodomorph, Lufengosaurus. So a carnivore and a herbivore, both with elongate necks, stretched out necks. Also, in sauropodomorphs and theropods, they have a derived trait in which the second manual digit, that is the pointer finger, is the longest in the hand. That's a derived trait. When we look at Ornithischians, by the way, the name is spelled there. When we look at Ornithischians, they have digit 3 the longest. Well, so do we. Look at your own hand. You have digit 3 the longest. Most hands have digit 3 the longest, or maybe digit 4 in some groups. But in sauropodomorphs and theropods, it's the pointer finger that's the longest. Now note this other group here, Herrerasaurus, that's the representative of a group which, as we'll see, might be a sort of Saurischian, but outside the specialized Saurischians. And it's got digit 3 the longest. It's got the ancestral trait. Also, the thumb claw. So, ungual of manual digit 1, thumb claw, is the biggest in the hand in theropods and sauropodomorphs. So that's another derived feature. Now, that group, Herrerasaurus, that taxon, Herrerasaurus, is part of a group called Herrerasauria. Herrerasaurs are known only from the Triassic. The best specimens are from South America. There are some relatively good ones from North America that seem to belong to this group, and a few scattered from other parts of the world. Herrerasaurs have been a problem because they have a mixture of features that are similar to the classic carnivorous dinosaurs, the theropods, but also a bunch of primitive traits. It's in this group that we have some that only have 2 sacrals. These guys have the digit 3, the longest, and so forth. And so where they fit has been argued back and forth. A series of recent studies have put them as Saurischians, that is closer to sauropodomorphs and theropods than to Ornithischians, but outside sauropodomorphs and theropods, in which case they represent the first radiation of carnivorous dinosaurs. They were never the apex predators. Wherever they occur, there's always bigger pseudoseuchian predators. But they were sort of like the jackals or the coyotes of their environment. They weren't the top predator, they weren't the lions, they weren't the tigers, but they were the secondary predators. Big grasping hands, slashing teeth, features we'll see repeated in the classic carnivorous dinosaurs. Here's a recently discovered one with an excellently preserved skull. And here's what the skull actually, that's not actually the real skull. The skull wasn't found, but the postcranial skeleton is real. And just to give you a sense of where some of these things go, some studies have put them as sauropodomorphs, as carnivorous sauropodomorphs. Others as early theropods. Others, and this is what we're going to have in class, is that they are Saurischians, but outside the theropod sauropodomorph group. Some even put them outside Dinosauria proper. These guys are just really freaking primitive. And even some studies where we accept Ornithoscelida, they're primitive sauropodomorphs, or, there's all sorts of positions. Okay. Now, I mentioned we have a standard phylogeny, but I'm going to mention now, we're going to wrap up this part with some non-traditional phylogenies that have been proposed in recent years. A number of studies from teams from South America have found the Silesaurids not to be the sister group to Dinosauria, but to actually be dinosaurs, and in fact, to be Ornithischian dinosaurs. So, and this is available on the lecture notes. It turns out that there are some traits shared between silesaurids and ornithischians, particularly with regard to the jaws and teeth. That is, these plant-chopping teeth that specialized silesaurids have are similar. They're not identical, but they're similar to the teeth of ornithischians. And the front end, the anterior part of the lower jaw of silesaurids, has this toothless tip. It's actually a little extra bone. There's one on each side in them. Now, as we'll see on Friday, ornithischians have a single bone, not a left and a right, but a single one that's toothless, that's at the front end of the jaw. And so some people said maybe this is a precursor of that. So here we see that bone in a true ornithischian. These are intriguing. But for silesaurids to be dinosaurs, all those traits I mentioned, like perforate acetabulum, the dinosaurian hand, the expansion of the supratemporal fenestra onto the frontoparietal fossa, and so forth, would have to be convergent between classic ornithischians and saurischians. So I would say the current weight of the evidence is that silesaurids are not dinosaurs, they're not ornithischians, and these similarities have to do with a similar diet, that is convergence for being plant eaters. Now, what's really annoying is that the most primitive ornithischian, probably, is so incomplete. The photograph there is what we know of Pisanosaurus, the only definite Triassic ornithischian. All of the ornithischians are from the Jurassic, or later. It's definitely a Triassic animal, it's well dated. It definitely appears to have that single bone in front of the lower jaw, although that bone's not preserved. The facet for it, the attachment point is there. But some people have argued that maybe it's not even a dinosaur at all, maybe it's a silesaurid. And then other people have argued, no, it is both a dinosaur and a silesaurid, that silesaurids are ornithischians. Maybe in future years, I'll accept the silesaurids are ornithischian hypothesis, but for now, I'm not going to. It is true, if silesaurids are dinosaurs, then we definitely now have Middle Triassic dinosaurs, and it would explain where all the missing ornithischians of the Triassic are. They're silesaurs, other than Pisanosaurus. But I'm not willing to go that way yet. But I want to make sure that you're aware of this hypothesis. Also, it's worth noting that if we do have these silesaurids as early ornithischians, the most primitive one is carnivorous, and so now we have carnivory very clearly as the ancestral condition for dinosaurs. Okay, non-traditional phylogeny 2. The Ornithoscelida hypothesis. 2017, a paper comes out that proposes that ornithischians and theropods are more closely related to each other than either is to sauropodomorphs. This flies in the face of the traditional hypothesis, but just because it does that doesn't mean it's wrong. And indeed, there are a number of traits that are more similar between theropods and ornithischians than are between either of those two groups with sauropodomorphs. But I will say that as other teams have examined this evidence, the Saurischian hypothesis tends to be supported better, and even a phylogenetic analysis by the guy who promoted Ornithoscelida has recently come out that shows Saurischia is the better supported hypothesis. Although he didn't highlight that in the paper, but that's what he found. But this is science, and it's quantifiable. And this great study, it's not been published, but it was presented at a conference, shows that although the Saurischian hypothesis looks a little stronger, it's only a little stronger. We can't say it's decisively stronger. So we're going to go with Saurischia as being the preferred hypothesis, but let's keep in mind just because it's preferred now doesn't mean that in future years we might say, no, Ornithoscelida is correct. And I just want to, for fairness' sake, say there's a third hypothesis. This is much more poorly supported than the other two, and that is that all the plant-eating dinosaurs form a clade, Phytodinosauria. So it's Diplodocus plus Iguanodon, and everything closer to them than to me. And that basically, the only support for that are features associated with chomping up plants. What we call Phylodont, that's leaf-shaped teeth, which we see in animals, many sorts of animals today that are plant-eating, and many sorts of animals in the past that we infer are plant-eating have this sort of broad teeth, these big projections on it. Iguana teeth look like this, for instance. Oh, here we go. There's a reconstruction showing some synapsids, parareptiles, some lizards, and some dinosaurs. Also, the front end of the dentary in Ornithischians has this extra bone that we'll talk about on Friday that has no teeth on it. It's edentulous, no teeth. And the very front tip of the lower jaw in primitive Sauropodomorphs also lacks teeth and probably had a little bit of a beak on it. So that might have been convergent, but the Phytodinosaurian hypothesis would say that it's a shared derived trait.
So, isn't there was a small hypothesis going around who beat sauropods at some point?
What's that?
Wasn't there a small hypothesis about potentially beat sauropods at some point?
Which sauropods?
Beaked sauropods.
Beaked yes, but this is the size of a beak. Oh, the beaked sauropods. We'll talk about, we're not the sauropods yet. Let's hold that off. Let's hold off sauropods. We're not the sauropods yet. We got a lot to cover.
Got it.
Right. And there are occasional dinosaurs that just defy us in terms of their proper position. Here's Chilesaurus, a late Jurassic dinosaur. So not an early dinosaur, one from sort of the middle of dinosaur history. It's from articulated skeletons, so we know it's one animal. It's not like bits and pieces thrown together. And yet, it's got theropod dinosaur traits, and it's got Ornithischian traits, and it's got Sauropodomorph traits. We don't know. It was somewhere on the phylogeny, but just to show we don't know where everything goes. So it's a dinosaur built by committee. It's cool looking. It's a herbivore. Okay, so in the wrap-up here, and I will actually record a little bit, in fact I'll record about 10 to 15 minutes of lecture after this so that we start fresh with Ornithischians. I will talk about the end of the age of Pseudotsuchians, so the big environmental changes that went from a world dominated by Pseudotsuchians to one dominated by dinosaurs. And then we'll start fresh on Friday. Those of you who are like Stegosaurus or Ankylosaurus fans, that's your time to shine.